Well, thank you everybody for coming. This topic is, where did the most improbable comeback of the 21st century come from anyway? And this is vinyl records. You know, it was in the scrap heap as recently as 15 years ago or so. And you see this group of people online. I wonder how many of them had the same story I had, that I sold most of my collection, about 4,000 LPs, in 2010. And then I just casually told a friend of mine that, and he said, "You did what? Why would you do that?" And at that point, I was trying to change my life. I was in a relationship. My girlfriend was into Feng Shui, and she talked me into digitizing my CDs. And so I got rid of 3,000 CDs too at the same time. But within 3 years, I realized what a colossal mistake I made. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So 20 years ago, vinyl was close to permanently being extinct. And now fans are lining up for blocks to buy records. Why is that? Is basically the question I'm going to answer by the end of this presentation. So you're probably wondering, who is Larry Jaffee? I've been writing about music ever since I was in college. Professionally, I never learned how to play piano. I did learn how to play guitar when I was 30, although I did have one when I was a teenager, and believe me, I wasn't any good. I remember my guitar teacher taught me Evil Ways by Santana because it was 2 chords. But my guitar was just so bad. It was like one of these you could get at a department store for like $69. So it was awful. And and by the way, that guitar that I'm holding there is an inflatable guitar that I was at a Latin music conference, and they had some sort of promotion going on. So that's not real. But I never did learn how to play piano. I really wish I did. Now I can't play anything because arthritis has afflicted my left index finger. So I suppose I could play one-handed, and figure out how to play without that finger. But anyway, so about 10 years ago, I decided to reorient my life and focus entirely on music because that's what made me happy. And at the time, I was writing about cybersecurity and was paid pretty well, and did it for a few more years. But in the back of my mind, once I got close to retirement, I'm going to try to do something with music. And it actually happened even sooner. In this photograph, I'm speaking at a Making Vinyl conference, which took place in Minneapolis. Making Vinyl is an event that I co-founded, a business-to-business conference that started in Detroit, and we've done in cities around the world, in fact. And we have another one coming up in early October. The other thing about the music business, and what really became the guiding light for me as far as this revival, was the opportunity to write the Record Store Day story. My book came out 2 years ago. And it's basically about a band of record store misfits and how they moved mountains to get the record industry to revive something that they just thought nobody cared. They were wrong. A little bit about me, circa 1964. This was the very first record that I owned. It was from my grandmother Edna. It was the World's Fair souvenir. It's a small world after all. You remember that song? I mean, at the time, baseball was really all I cared about. And my grandmother also, in that same year, 1964, gave me a transistor radio that looked a lot like this one. And it opened up a whole new world for me. And I was able to hear Beatlemania basically unfold. So as I said before, I've been writing and been around music since high school. In fact, I had my own, I would call them garage band. We never made it out of my friend's living room. But I managed a band when I was in high school. I had auditioned, and I was pretty antisocial in high school, but there was an opportunity to pick a band for the dance. This was like the type of dance I would never go to myself. But I figured I want to get into the music business. This is a great way to do it. So they allowed me to do it because I guess nobody else wanted that job. I auditioned a bunch of bands, and I picked the best one, and I became their manager. And I would do guest spots with them and sing like Aerosmith songs and Ramones songs on the choruses and things like that. Meanwhile, I have my own band. And I'll tell you, if there was one thing that I could have from my past, is a cassette of me imitating Mick Jagger doing Jumpin' Jack Flash. It was pretty good. I don't know what happened to the tape. So I've met 3 Sex Pistols, but only 2 Beatles. And this being a college setting, at this point, I'd like to ask the class, which Beatles do you think I met? I'm just curious. I met Paul McCartney and Ringo. But the thing is, John and George were my two favorites. So when I met both of those, Ringo and Paul, I was not nervous at all. The Sid Vicious story is really interesting. I was covering his pre-trial hearing for murder. It was a media circus. I was still in college, actually, and I was covering it for this fanzine based in Connecticut. And I missed the elevator after lunch, so I had to wait for the next one. I get into the next one, and who walks in with me? Sid Vicious and his lawyer. At the time, I said to him, I figured this is an amazing opportunity. I can't ask him about, did you do it? But instead what I asked, did you hear the new Clash record, which had just come out? Give him enough rope. And the lawyer sister said, don't answer that. And I was like, why? So I'm not really into numerology, but things about this year in particular, 2024, struck me. If we go back 60 years. So 1964, my dad says, we're watching the Ed Sullivan Show. We had watched the news with all the riots at JFK. My dad says, the Beatles are a communist plot. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know what a Beatle is. I don't know what a communist is, but I want to be part of this. I got him so crazy. In 1974, I go to my first real rock concert at Nassau Coliseum, which was Eric Clapton. In 1984, I started teaching journalism at Hofstra, not too far away from here. In 1994, I met Paul McCartney, breaking up his historic meeting with Yoko in terms of that was the day that she gave him the tape that had Free as a Bird and a couple of the John demos. I didn't know that. And Paul was very nice. And I didn't even ask him any music questions. I gave him a newspaper. I had published a newspaper about a British TV show called EastEnders. And I read on the nascent internet at the time that Linda and Paul were huge fans. So he gladly accepted it. And then I quietly left. In 2004, I flew to London because Mick Ralphs was guesting with Ian Hunter. They were members of the rock band Mott the Hoople, which was my favorite band. While everybody in my high school was listening to Led Zeppelin, I was listening to Mott the Hoople. Ian Hunter and I had done a couple of interviews over the years, and he told me he never thought that Mott the Hoople would ever get back together. 5 years later, they did do two actual tours, one in 2019, another one in 2013, but I flew to London to see that very first concert. And next to seeing the Beatles perform and the Velvet Underground, I don't think there was any other band that I thought I'd never see, live. And then in 2014, I was telling my friend Randy here on the drive in that I've seen Bob Dylan probably 35 times, and the best show was probably the first one in 1975. And the next best one was in 2014. I saw a lot of bad Bob Dylan shows, although I buy his records all the time. And then in 2024, I finally get to teach a music writing class at St. John's, which is starting a week from Friday. So I am very happy about that. Okay, and I want to thank Tim Clare. So when I was in high school, I desperately wanted to work in a record store. And no one would ever give me a job, and I had to work at the supermarket. And around 2013, I was selling the remnants, maybe it was even 2012. I was selling the remnants of my record collection, not record collection, but CDs with cassettes and magazines. I remember, So he's tallying up how much money he's going to give me, and then I am going through the dollar bin, and I find this burlesque record that looked interesting to me. And I pull out $1, and he says, keep it, I don't know, I just thought burlesque clubs had jazz music in the background. It was on Cameo Parkway. It was from 1962. I don't know, just look, the cover was kind of hideous, and I put it on. I still had a turntable, even though I had hardly any records then. And I was like, I'm back. I really like this stuff. And then probably about 6 months later, Tim moved his store to Kings Park, where I was living. And Kings Park never had a record store. And at some point, Tim asked, you want to cover the store for me? And here I am in my mid-50s, and I'm finally getting to work in a record store. I mean, it was really fantastic for me. And sitting next to Tim here is our friend Ted, who Ted and I became friends at Tim's place. And this is actually very key to the vinyl revival, that record stores were where people met potentially future spouses or partners or bandmates, learned about life, learned about music. And I realized that was something that was missing from my life. And also during the CD age, people didn't really refer to it as the CD store. You were still going to the record store. And interesting, the technical legal word for physical media is phonorecord. But the only people who know that are lawyers, entertainment lawyers. But anyway, I fast forward to December 1969, and I started a new school when my family moved to Long Island, and I was basically placed at the nerd table. And this kid had this reel-to-reel recorder similar to the one up on the slide and demonstrated it. And I was like, wow, I love that. I'm going to get one once I get some birthday money or something. So I go to, I think it was Corvette's. They didn't have a reel-to-reel. This is days before e-commerce. But they did have a tape recorder similar to the one over there. It wasn't a Panasonic, but I can't remember who the manufacturer was. But I bought that Chuck Berry cassette. I still have it. It's a prized possession. 1973 was the year I became a record collector. And it was a wonderful year. It changed my life. On my bedroom walls, I had a Rolling Stones poster that was very similar to this one. I think Bill Wyman wasn't positioned the way that he is over there, but otherwise, no, I guess that's Rick Keith on the far end. No, I mean, on this side is Taylor, but on the other side, yeah, and the poster I had, Keith was facing, and Wyman actually wasn't. He was on my poster, but I guess he's not in the frame on this one. But it was definitely that same concert because they were dressed exactly the same. But my first record purchase was introducing the Beatles. It was a 99-cent cutout. And then I think the next day I bought Hot Rocks, which was a double record. I mean, what a way to really start with the Beatles and Stones. And while I was in college, I started working for a local band. And I'm curious if anybody in the audience remembers them, Wowie. And the interesting thing, I would go around to the radio stations as well as the jukeboxes, giving them their independently pressed single. And I managed to get Jim Kerr to play it on live radio on WPIX. Jim had come to Hofstra to do a charity event for a fraternity that my roommate was involved in. So we stayed in touch, and then Jim called me actually while I was in my dorm room once. He goes, I'm about to play your record. Jim and I actually stayed in touch, and years later I put him on the cover of Promo magazine. And here's the best part about it. Well, I mean, what happened was the band got signed to Elektra Records, and then it was shelved permanently through no fault of the band. I mean, they made a lot of mistakes along the way, and their producer was also their lawyer, which was also their manager. There was a lot of conflicts of interest, and they had a change in management at Elektra, so whoever signed them did not honor the contract. Unfortunately, the record never came out, but did actually get released on vinyl last year, partly through my own urging. The bass player and I, who's Peter with the shag haircut, with the Farrah Fawcett haircut, he and I were back in touch through Facebook. I hadn't seen each other in 40 years, but we had a great reunion. We're still very much in touch. So who remembers flipping through records at the record store? Not everybody in the audience? Okay. So this quote from Mark Twain basically sums up the vinyl comeback. The report of my death was an exaggeration. What goes around comes around. Last year was the 75th anniversary of the LP. And you'll see, in 1964 they went from vinyl, then they had 8 tracks in 67. Cassettes were actually introduced prior to 1972, but they were, I guess, kind of popular in 72. CDs were very popular in 85, although they were introduced in 83. The iPod and MP3 files in the early 2000s, back to the LP. But how did this happen? Now, the people who are involved in vinyl's resurgence are not delusional. We realize it's a digital world, and we realize there are plenty of other ways to listen to music that doesn't cost any money, in fact. And to buy a record today is kind of expensive. And here, if you notice, 9%, this is a new chart that just was on the internet the other day. And this is also based on statistics from IFPI, the International Record Industry. And actually, I asked them how they tabulate their results, and they were kind of vague. So, because I wonder if the especially physical side, meaning the vinyl record side, is actually a lot larger than 9%, but I'll get more into that later. The RIAA, which is the Record Industry Association of America, put out a number that said 43.5 million records were shipped last year. And again, this doesn't make any sense. I'll talk about it, why. And then the other thing that made the rounds, and I'm curious how many of you heard this, that 50% of the people who buy records don't even own a record player or a turntable. How many of you heard that? Okay. So the media actually loves those types of headlines. I went back to the company Luminate that put it out there, and I said, did you ask the question, were you buying that record as a gift? And maybe that's why the person didn't have a record player, but they did buy a record? And they said, no, we didn't ask that question. I studied empirical research in graduate school. I know there's many ways to skew a survey to get the result that you want. And I'm suggesting that Luminate, used to be known as Nielsen, did that on purpose because they knew they would get attention with a stupid factoid there that really doesn't hold any kind of reality. So, but getting back, why are people lining up? And it's a marketing term, FOMO. Anyone know what FOMO is? Missing out, right. And usually retailers, no matter what they're selling, you know, they have these sales and they limited quantities. And now this line over here, that line probably even went around the block here. This was in Los Angeles and Hollywood, waiting for the 2012 Amoeba Records Record Store Day. And next to it is here on Long Island, Looney Tunes. That guy planted himself there the afternoon before Record Store Day was going to open at 8 o'clock the next morning. He wanted to make sure he was first. So if I ever do another edition of the book, I want to put him on the cover, actually, maybe. You know, like I said, how many of those people are there just to buy the limited edition records? Or what? I mean, what else? How many have stories? And when I do Record Store Day, and again, I have to thank Tim Clare about this. So it was like, I think in December 2013, and I pull out a Civil Wars record, and it had like this gold sticker on it. It's a Record Store Day, and I was like, what's Record Store Day? That's how clueless I was. Record Store Day started in 2008. That was when the first one happened. I had no idea. I missed the first 5 years of Record Store Day. So yes, fear of missing out. But I mean, when you think about it, we're going back to a technology that's not that far from the Flintstones record there. I mean, sure, there's no electricity in that one, but Emil Berliner invented the first circular disc in 1888. The process that he made his records is not that different from what happens today. But meanwhile, vinyl ruled in the 1960s and 1970s. That was like an original tower record store. I love this photograph of Muhammad Ali with a portable 45 player in his car. I have another photo of George Harrison also doing that. Probably it's not a good idea. I mean, but although I don't own a car right now, when I did have a car, and if you were able to buy that, I probably would have bought it. So. In 1980s, home entertainment changed. MTV specifically had video to music. And I remember what an exciting thing that was in the early 80s. Video games actually first took off, like late 70s, early 80s. I was never really into that stuff. I was just purely into music. But also the Walkman also emerged in the early 80s. And in fact, cassettes were the most popular format in the mid 80s to early 90s. And the LPs actually peaked in 1984. And one of the reasons why this switch happened was that the major labels needed to reinvent themselves because they were losing market share to MTV, to video games. And they came up with this new creation, the CD, that music was portable. They had these little Discmans, and it sounded better sometimes. You didn't hear the crackle and pop on LPs that you sometimes got. And it was a really good business for quite a while. But the worst nightmare of the record industry occurred in 1999 when Napster emerged. And at the same time, PCs took off. And PCs were also equipped with drives. And I actually had my first internet job in 1996. And our boss actually wanted to know if the drive in the computer was where you put your coffee cup. So we said, no, that's not it. So meanwhile, while the record industry was trying to figure out this new digital world that was about to explode, they were convinced that digital audio tape was the enemy, and that's what we had to focus on. You remember in the 80s especially, they used to have that marketing campaign, home taping is killing the record industry. And they would have the skull and the crossbones, and that's how they treated the DAT, which was a Japanese invention. Sony basically came up with it, and it never took off. Like it was a professional medium.
Digital compact cassette as well.
Right.
That was the one that they really tried because that was backward compatible.
Right, and then also we could lump in mini disc was like another thing that Sony also created, but the only place that sold was in Japan. Yeah. But meanwhile, the RIAA didn't think about trying to attach royalties to blank CDs. And I remember back in 1999, the joke around the office when I was editing Media Line was, what's the best-selling album of the year? And it was a blank CD. You know? So the rise and fall of the compact disc coincided with me having the best job of my career. I started in January 1998 when CDs were pretty much at its peak, and it rapidly declined. I mean, DVD was just getting underway too, but DVD was also declining by the end of my tenure there. But Phil Ramone, the great producer of Frank Sinatra, Billy Joel, you name it, said to me in 2002, he saw the writing on the wall. And he said, well, the CDs have had a pretty good run. But 25 years into it, he thought it was done. And then at the same time, that same year, Bob Irwin, who owns a label, he's now retired, but the label still exists, Sundays. And Bob was also a reissue producer for Sony. He said to me, vinyl's coming back. And I thought he was crazy. At the time, Bob was licensing the vinyl rights and pressing them in mono of the entire Bob Dylan catalog, the Byrds catalog. The labels didn't want to have anything to do with vinyl at that point. So he was able to make a pretty good business for a while out of it. And meanwhile, Apple came in with their better version of an MP3 player, the iPod. But it was just a stopgap. We were waiting for what we used to call the celestial jukebox in the sky, which emerged with Spotify and some of the other streaming services. Now, 2006 was a terrible year, mainly because it was the implosion of Tower Records as a chain, which had about 250 stores nationally, as well as an international presence as well. But here, I mean, in the New York metro area, it wasn't only Tower that went away, especially in Manhattan. HMV had 2 or 3 stores. Virgin Megastore had, whatever they were doing in the US, they got rid of. And eventually they got rid of them elsewhere as well. Also, I mean, all of the Nobody Beats the Wiz, all those, and the independent record chains, like Coconuts, there were a lot of, Sam Goody, I guess, still, or Musicland, I forget what they call it now, still exists in what they called Fouilleur Entertainment, FYE, I think, basically morphed in that. But that was the only chain type that really stayed in business. Although Tower is big in Japan, and actually a friend of mine on Facebook yesterday posted some photos of what's going on there. But nothing could save my magazine, which was killed in 2006. Yeah, so they didn't listen to me in November 2002. I wrote 10 Ways to Save the Record Industry. Well, oddly enough, on that top 10 list, I didn't say anything about vinyl. I said basically they need to bring back singles, but I was thinking CD singles or even digital singles, which Apple basically created. So the record stores that were still in business, and these were mostly independent stores, after seeing what happened to Tower Records and the other chains, were thinking, do we still have a livelihood? It could be an opportunity if we reinvent ourselves. So a few of them actually came up with this idea. They were going to meet in Baltimore in 2007. And there's a definite correlation in terms of record sales going up when Record Store Day began and when vinyl sales were being tracked. 2 of the stores actually, prior to that meeting in Baltimore, came up with the same idea. They sold used records. They noticed that those used record bins would disappear almost as soon as it came in. And a few of them also sold comic books, and they were saying, well, the comic book publishers have, and they call it Free Comic Book Day. They weren't talking about giving away records, but they were talking about what can we do, like throw a party for the community, get people interested in music again, have some bands play live in the store, and it worked. I mean, much to the surprise. And these three coalitions came together. And the funny thing is, in that meeting at Baltimore, for reasons I still don't understand, even though I researched it in this book, is they left that on the agenda to the very end as people were leaving the conference. So there were only about less than a dozen people left from this conference that had several hundred delegates. So those dozen were unanimous. Yeah, we might as well try bringing back new vinyl. And what happened was they found out that, one, the artists loved the idea. And in fact, in that very first launch of Record Store Day in 2008, Metallica did an in-store signing. They were there all day long. 500 fans came through. They stopped and talked to each fan, had pictures taken, signed autographs, and they actually would sign records, whatever. At the first Record Store Day, there wasn't a lot of music being available, like newly pressed, fear of missing out type stuff. There was some. There was like a dozen releases or something like that. It was the next year when they realized that they really had something special, that 100 releases were available. And that's when people started lining up for real. Meanwhile, on Saturday Night Live, they made fun of Record Store Day. But meanwhile, the artists, like Questlove, who has this amazing record collection, St. Vincent, and Jack White, and this is me and Jack White after his concert in Brooklyn 2 years ago. Jack actually contributed an essay to my book. So making records is a complicated, expensive process. And I'll give you an example how the economics have changed. In Los Angeles in the 70s, there were a dozen record pressing plants competing. And the thing is, if you came in with cash, they would press anything, including the first bootleg by Bob Dylan. And I actually wrote an article about that. I interviewed at length the first bootlegger. And he told me exactly how they did it. And he was the one who told me I had no problems getting my records pressed. As long as I had money, they would do it. And it was even better if they didn't ask, if you didn't put a label on it. So that's how you get the white labels. But listen to music on vinyl when all you can get is free or for a nominal fee. I mean, I remember a friend of mine in the early 2000s, and I would still buy vinyl once in a while. I would go to record shows. I bought mostly CDs. And I told him about this. YouTube, I think, started around 2005. And it's like, I don't buy CDs. I get all the music plus video, like from YouTube. Why would I buy a CD? And then, of course, after Spotify happened, Amazon got into streaming, so did Apple. But it defies logic that vinyl would come back from a technological, from an economic, and an ecological perspective. And the thing is, from the musician's perspective, they're not making any money from streaming unless you're an A-list superstar. They get pennies for the streams. And then Spotify keeps on introducing these draconian, if you don't have 1,000 streams, you're not getting paid anything. So look, I mean, the growth is undeniable, yet people prefer that. As I said, vinyl enthusiasts are not delusional. But the experience of dropping the needle on a record, like first opening it up, taking it out, looking at the cover art, the liner notes, you don't get that from digital music. It's impossible. People like to show off this stuff to their friends. And it's similar to those people who still buy DVDs. My friend John Waters, the film director, he said that anything that gets people to rebuy what they already own, I'm in favor of that. And that's actually, in a nutshell, why vinyl stuck this time. When the CDs emerged in the mid-'80s, they also cost twice as much as a vinyl record did. And what's happening now, a vinyl record costs twice as much as what a CD cost back then. So now you're spending $30 for a record that you paid $15 on a CD, which you at that point thought was a lot of money back then. And people now are getting rid of their CD collections and rebuying on vinyl, like me. And by the way, my record collection's now back to its former glory, partly thanks to Tim, who didn't pay me, but he said, take whatever used records you want. And touring musicians also make a hell of a lot more money if they organize their own manufacturing and they make a 50% profit. So it costs about $10 to make a pressed record, they could sell for 20, 25. And that's a really nice profit. Now, if they did it through the label and they had to wait for royalties to come trickling down, that's another story. But musicians are pretty wise. I think they have more opportunities to get their music out there, and sometimes they just bite the bullet and give away stuff for free. But live performance, on the other hand, the merch table is great. Okay, I said that it defies all logic. Technological, we're in the digital age. Economic, costs at least $10 to make a record. Ecological, PVC is a petroleum-based byproduct. Why was Record Store Day successful? Well, because the economic model changed. The labels basically said, we will not accept returns on this new vinyl that we're pressing. And it's not they were pressing, the independent pressing plants were doing it. They pulled out of that business. Warner, Sony, Universal, they all had their own pressing plants at some point. And in fact, my friend Bob Irwin from Sundays begged Universal not to close the plant that they had in upstate New York. They didn't listen. So the volume was very low too, in terms of the units pressed for Record Store Day. Could be as little as 500 copies, but typically 3,000 is RSD special release. And they would show up the next day on eBay for hundreds of dollars. So there's the fear of missing out. Like, you don't want to pay that much, so you might as well be there and wait in line. But the pandemic actually turned out to be a real boon for the vinyl industry, especially because it changed the demographics. And as I go into detail in my book, that the no returns on vinyl killed vinyl in 1991. And they said, but we'll accept returns on CDs. So that made sure that the CD format stuck. And meanwhile, as I said, cassettes were like in the middle ground. And I remember this happened to me in 1985. The Talking Heads album, Little Creatures, came out. I wanted it on LP. I forgot what store I was at. They said, we don't have that, but we have the cassette. And so I bought the cassette. I wasn't happy because I couldn't read the liner notes. They were so tiny. And by the way, I mentioned the book. So who remembers the very first record they bought? And can give me a story about it, James? You already have the book though, right? I think you have a copy. I wanted somebody who doesn't have the book, and you have the book. Somebody else, give me a story or your first music memory. Yes.
There was always vinyl in my house. My parents played music from the day I could remember, so it was part of life.
You would be a great student for my St. John's class. Because that's one of the questions and assignments they have, is for them to, what's their first music memory? And also, what music did their parents like? And what do you think of that music now? And the interesting thing is, my mother passed away in 2017. And I realized that I inherited from her the collector gene. I mean, she never passed up a cassette bin at a drugstore. And she had really good taste. I mean, she had like a who's who of popular music, and would even have stuff like Aretha Franklin's like blues stuff in Columbia on cassette. And she had Whitney Houston, and she had plenty of Sinatra and Tony Bennett and people like that who I grew to really like. And I remember when I was in college, I bought a Frank Sinatra's Greatest Hits LP, and I love those songs, like Something Stupid, and it was a very good year. I mean, those amazing pop songs. Yeah, I'm a rock and roll snob, as you can see from my shirt. But I mean, I grew up a rock kid, but I grew to love all kinds of music. And actually, getting back to my mom, she suffered from dementia the last 6-7 years of her life. And music was one thing that sort of snapped her out of the stupor. So that was really wonderful. And I would listen to a vinyl record I had by Sonny Rollins called G-Man. It was just him honking on his horn to basically what I'm dealing with my mom, how upsetting it was for me personally. So this is an opening quote. And by the way, here's the book, before I forget. What's your name? Jana, I'll sign it for you afterwards, if you like.
Thanks so much.
Sure. So Gerd Bloom was the Senior Vice President of Distribution of Sony International. And I interviewed him for the book, and he said he was talking about vinyl. I saw it dying, I saw it dead, and I saw it rising from the grave. And what's interesting about this is Sony was dragged into the vinyl resurgence, as well as Universal. Warner was, of the three major conglomerates, Warner was the only one that really was in right from the start. The other two spent like 6, 7 years before they started putting out vinyl because they saw there was a market for it. So the independent labels are the ones that really got behind Record Store Day and the vinyl resurgence. So in 2013, I actually came up with an idea to do a conference. And like I said, I didn't even really know about Record Store Day. But anyway, I had an inkling that there might be a business opportunity. So I was already producing conferences for those companies that were still manufacturing CDs. And my co-founder of Making Vinyl, actually I pitched him in 2013, and he thought it was too much too soon. He was probably right. And then at the beginning of 2017, he called me. He said, remember that idea you had about doing a vinyl conference? I think we're going to do it. And I said, we are? When? He said, in the fall. I was like, really? So we basically came up with this idea, and it came down to, if you build it, they will come. And we got very lucky. I mean, the planets lined up, and Jack White agreed to be our keynote speaker. And also we had Darryl McDaniels from Run DMC to also speak. And I was standing in the back of the room while somebody was speaking, and I have to say this was my proudest moment in my career. I was like, I came up with this idea, and it worked. And it's grown since then. The pandemic actually sort of stunted it a little bit. But in 2018, we went back to Detroit, and I was basically giving the half-year report from the RIAA. And they said 9.5 million units were distributed of vinyl. And in the audience, people are yelling, that's way low. Those numbers make absolutely no sense. And afterwards, after I spoke, when we had a break, I asked one of the attendees who owned a Los Angeles press. He said, I already did 4 million myself. United Record Pressing in Nashville is much larger than I did. They must have done twice as much as me. The numbers make absolutely no sense. And the other people there at the event also told me anecdotally similar types of things. So I realized these numbers that Nielsen's been putting out there make absolutely no sense.
It tracks the comments both optic disc as well as vinyl. And you could tell by the amount of
Right.
shipped how much that makes. They're not sprinkling it on their breakfast. They're making records.
I probably talked to the wrong person who knows the secret sauce of what you're talking about. But the other thing about the three majors, the RIAA only represents 85% of the music being sold. 50% are the independent labels, which are the ones that are the biggest involved in vinyl. So they're just guessing what they think those 15% sell, and they really don't have any idea. Making Vinyl is in the middle of a research study that I basically pushed for, that is getting the volumes from the pressing plants. And well, let me just, so these are we track all the pressing plants around the world. There are about 190 pressing plants right now. And we have about 40% of the returns back. This is our research partner is in the UK, and before he went on vacation a few weeks ago, he said, we already know that we have 110 million have been pressed to date this year. I mean, actually, he was talking about 2023, not 2024. He said, but we just still don't have 60% of the potential audience. So 110 million, but then meanwhile, well, I'll show you the numbers before. They said 46 million was pressed, or something like that. Was sold last year. Again, it makes no sense. And then right before we went public that we were doing Making Vinyl, the Wall Street Journal comes out with this ridiculous article, why vinyl's boom is over. And I tried to get this Neil Shah on the phone. He wouldn't talk to me. And I said, if you really want to find out what's happening in the record pressing world, you should come, because you'll get it from the sources. I don't know where you're coming up with these ideas, but they're not right. And that's even more so. And last year I had a similar exchange with this Ted Goya, who's like supposedly this great prognostic music researcher. He wrote a great book about the blues, but he knows nothing about today's vinyl world. And there was another article here, the vinyl revival is coming to a crashing halt, but don't blame Taylor Swift. And I'll talk a little bit about Taylor Swift in a minute. But Making Vinyl, if you build it, they will come. The pandemic actually sort of stunted our growth. We had 450 industry professionals in Los Angeles. And then in 2020, we had in December of 2020, we had a virtual event. It wasn't the same thing. I mean, it was successful from a virtual perspective. As I said, when we started making vinyl, there were only 35 factories on both sides of the Atlantic. Half of them came to our event and talked. What we didn't know was that in the audience, there were 20 others about to open their factories. Same thing happened in 2018 and in 2019. So the growth was exponential. That's why the RIAA doesn't know what the hell they're talking about, and neither does Luminate especially. So why has vinyl returned? It's because the campaign that record stores are cool places to hang out, important to the community. And in the book, actually, I go into some detail about how when hurricanes would hit communities and record stores were luckily spared not losing electricity, they invited people to stay there for several days at the store. The exclusive RSD releases quickly sold out, became valuable collectibles, and CDs made vinyls come back happen by getting people used to paying twice as much what they already owned. But more importantly, and probably most importantly, the demographics changed. That previously it was classic rock, baby boomers. Classic rock, I say, their favorite genre. Or even, jazz enthusiasts. Also, that stuff was available on vinyl to some extent. But it shifted to Gen Z and millennials, which is really important for the future growth of the industry. And on the far end is my daughter, whose boyfriend took this photograph of them in Barcelona, Spain, and I think it was 2021. I guess everyone was still wearing masks. She's as much of an enthusiast. She's 26. Today she started her third year of law school at New York Law School, and we sometimes go record shopping. What's great, and the book is actually dedicated to her. I have somebody to inherit my record collection, which is a really important thing to have. So I mentioned Taylor Swift. And my daughter, by the way, is a Swiftie. Although she hasn't seen her in concert, and she agrees paying $1,500 for a ticket is absolutely insane. But in 2022, she dominated. She had the #1 record. I guess Midnight's was the #1 record that year. And then Folklore was still selling pretty healthy at #7. Now this illuminates numbers, so who knows if, how real they really are. On the other hand, the RIAA would get the sales from Universal. So in terms of the numbers of distributed, that should be pretty accurate. Okay, last year, 1 out of every 15 vinyl records sold was by Taylor Swift. This is an article from Billboard. She sold herself nearly 3.5 million vinyl LPs. And then in 2024, she did a really shrewd thing. She released her record the night before Record Store Day. So in the stores that I visited on Record Store Day this past April, it wasn't a Record Store Day release, but they had it as if it was. It was really smart. And actually, I forgot that it was being released. So when I bought like 8 or 10 Record Store Day releases. It was over $300 per. But among them was the Taylor Swift for my daughter. You have a question? No, Jamie? Okay. Now, it's interesting. Record Store Day's ambassador, every year they pick an artist to be the ambassador. And in 2022, when my book came out, which was the 15th anniversary of Record Store Day, Taylor Swift was the ambassador. So I begged Record Store Day to put that sticker of Taylor Swift on the book cover. Anything that sort of like that. And he was like, no, we can't do that. That would be tantamount to a endorsement. We didn't even ask her for that. But what's the point of her being ambassador if you can't do that? I mean, meanwhile, Billie Eilish is a very popular Gen Z artist. She tweeted about my book. So that gave me a little credibility. And my daughter actually couldn't believe that I was mentioned in the same sentence as Taylor Swift in a Record Collector magazine article. So that was good. I mean, it helped that I had been published in Record Collector. So this is the 2023 World View. 5 of the 10 most popular vinyl records were from Taylor Swift internationally, including catalog releases. And what's also really significant is 8 of the 10 albums in the top 10 were millennial or Gen Z favorites, like Olivia Rodrigo, I mean, of course, Lana Del Rey, but Taylor Swift, obviously, and Kendrick Lamar as well. But the only 2 classic rock, which will show up on the list every year, is Fleetwood Mac's Rumors and Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. And sometimes, depending on the year, Michael Jackson might show up, Prince, Purple Rain might show up, Beatles, Abbey Road might show up in that list. So this is not your parents' record business, and this is actually the couple that were on the cover of the Woodstock record. They both since passed away, which is sad. And kids are actually into soundtracks like the Grease movie. They love musicals like that. And a friend of mine from NYU, who's from Long Island actually, he found that 50% of vinyl buyers today are identified as female. And there are all kinds of alternative materials for records. And if you go back to the 60s, how many remember Wheaties, and they sometimes had records on the back of it? So you could make a record, you could hear something made out of paper. You could also, I haven't heard any of these records, but made out of coffee. There used to be on the internet, when I was preparing for this, it was gone. There was a demonstration of a record made out of soap. And then been records made out of plastic straws. And my favorite is actually, getting your ashes pressed into a record. And I think I might end up doing this. There's a company going, like you could put on whatever music, as long as it's a private thing for your family or something like that, put your favorite song, But the global music industry is seeking sustainable solutions to reduce its carbon footprint. And they believe climate change is real, and they've formed all kinds of committees to study this. I didn't know that PVC was a toxic, used, toxic additives, and especially if they go into the landfill, that's not gonna help the environment any. And in fact, Greenpeace calls PVC the most damaging record. I decided, besides making vinyl, I wanted to start participating in the business myself. And it was in 2022 when I first heard about this material made out of sugar beets. And it was sort of just lodged in my brain, and I didn't really know what to make of it. It was the next year when I was on a panel at Making Vinyl with a guy from Iceland. The previous year, I went through Iceland to get to Amsterdam. And the in-flight entertainment was amazing. And I'm thinking to myself, if there's any place, and I didn't know any of the artists other than Bjork. And I figured, if there's any place in the world that needs a record factory, it might be Iceland. So I was on this panel with this guy who owns a record factory in Copenhagen, Denmark. And I said to him, what do you think about doing a record factory in Iceland? He goes, well, I already sell like 25%. I already make 25% of the records that are sold in Iceland. He goes, yeah, I think about it. All right. What I didn't know was another guy speaking at the event who helped the other guy build his plant had just gone through Iceland on that very trip in Minneapolis, spent 24 hours there, and had the same idea as I did. So when I realized that the next October, later last year, October, I said, the three of us have to figure out how we can make this happen. Let's do it for real. And I did a lot more research. So there's less than 400,000 residents of Iceland, right? But they have 2.5 million people. It's like one of the most popular tourist attractions of the world, the destinations. And it's used in all kinds of movies and TV shows because it's just an amazing place to see. And it's an ecologically minded government. It's very expensive to ship in records. So I had a feeling, once I did some research, I realized, we might be able to get government subsidies for this business. And then also I found out, okay, in a country of less than 400,000 people, there are 90 music schools. The Grammy winner for Best Soundtrack is from Iceland. Regularly. These are like the top composers of new classical music is coming out of Iceland. 400 orchestras in a country of less than 400,000 people. 15 record stores. 1 out of every 3 Icelanders are musicians. And they're in 5 different bands. And they all love vinyl. So I was like, I think we have something here. We also found out that it is very inexpensive electricity is very inexpensive because of geothermal power, which is why there are volcanoes in Iceland, which actually, it just went off again about 2-3 days ago. And the funny thing is, my partners and I, 2 days after we left in March, I'll show you a photo, it started erupting again. So I missed it. That was one of the reasons I wanted to be there for that. I didn't see it. But how do sugar beet LPs sound? Which is really, really important question. A producer from Abbey Road, where the Beatles, Pink Floyd, and numerous other bands and orchestras record, was speechless how amazing, the record, that it wasn't a regular PVC record. And then in fact, a company that manufactures the studio speakers was so impressed with the sound of the records that he invested in the company, which is called Evolution Music. And among the three founders, I'm in the middle here, Kevin with the on the end, closest to me, he's the technical director of Evolution Music. So he's our CTO. And on the far end is Gummy, who's originally from Iceland. And we're standing in a lava field, basically, which was covered again with lava like soon thereafter. So, I mean, it's just a wild place to be. What's interesting is the fact, so Gummy actually has a sister-in-law who works in a business development capacity for the government. And they found out what we were planning. And they put us in touch with this abandoned factory. And I mean, has anyone here been to Iceland? You have? Okay. How long ago? 10 years. 10 years. Okay. So 10 years ago, the government bought this abandoned building, which was going to be used for manufacturing aluminum. Now, Alcoa is actually a major manufacturer of aluminum in Iceland. It's a very controversial subject with the environmentalists there, including Bjork, who's was the lead singer of a band called the Sugar Cubes, which I had their first CD. I mean, I liked one of the songs I liked the whole album, actually. And it turns out one of our biggest champions for this project is the former drummer of the Sugar Cubes. But anyway, this building was purchased by the government, and they decided to repurpose it. And most of the individuals who were involved in this enterprise came from the fishing industry. So fishing is the number one export in Iceland. But they repurpose 100% of the fish when it comes out of the water. They don't just throw it in the landfill what they don't use. They figure out how to use it for something else. So they have a few tenants already set up. And this structure is 2.5 football fields long. They were saying internally, we're known for our culture and our arts. Why isn't that reflected here? So they found out about us. And we have our first meeting, and they have a stereo set up for us. So they were really happy that we wanted to be there. And it's outside Reykjavik, and it's actually 5 minutes away from the international airport, the factory. So they're planning on turning it into like a tourist place that at the airport they would promote it, and hopefully people would find some time to come by. And in fact, we have a meeting tomorrow to discuss the blueprints, and in the front over here is where they're planning on putting a stage. So our idea is basically musicians to get their records made with us can play concerts there eventually. We have actually communications going on with the recording studios that are there, and this is one of the other things that the government has done is they give back 25% of what musicians pay to record in Iceland. So it will take a change of the law, but some legislators not aware of us that once we're legally registered with the country, they're talking about changing the law that musicians would get 25% back to get their record made in Iceland. And then meanwhile, it would cost probably a little bit more money because of this different type of material, the sugar beets material. But we're also talking about possibly, this is something beyond my company, but a major chemical company would establish a processing plant there in Iceland so that we could grow the sugar beets in the you see, they have a greenhouse planned, and they already have like a Japanese strawberry grower actually as one of their tenants. So there's a lot of exciting things happening with this. Getting back to the young people, Gen Z is willing to pay more. 71% of them are willing to pay more for a record that protects the environment. And even when you look at some of the older demographics, 40 to 45%, they would pay, decent percentages, 49%, 55%, 52%, 38%. So if it costs $40 instead of $30, they'd be okay with that. Now, this is not so much in Iceland, but in Iceland, the fastest growing segment of the population is young people. So, but we're also thinking, when we're talking to investors, they always want to know, what's the scalability of this project? Iceland's a tiny country. It's kind of small. So I said, yeah, but the three major labels are talking about already testing other types of materials. And they realize that the fossil fuel thing doesn't cut it anymore. So there's something called bioplastic, and there's one record called biovinyl. But that's a portion of it is still using regular vinyl. And some of it is actually recycled cooking oil. It's like a hybrid type of record, almost. Yeah, but there's still some portion of it from fossil fuel. Once we make it to, the company's called Thermal Beats Pressing, and then we'll also have a sister label called Thermal Beats Records, where we're planning on releasing unreleased concerts from major artists that potentially could have like a really big international. While we're building the factory, we could have the Sugar Beats records made in Denmark. So in fact, there's a big music festival in Iceland in November, and we are going to produce a sampler of the unsigned bands that are playing this festival, like their best songs, and we'll have it out by November. So I'd like to take some questions. Anyone? Yes?
We're trying to figure it out. You talk about the independent pressing organizations. How do they get the rights to press the records?
Well, there's still, copyrights are still very important. And it's not like the 70s where there was a lot of corruption. And a lot of times counterfeits were being made very quickly. Now, it's not to say that counterfeits aren't made today, especially in Eastern Europe, especially, as well as China is coming out of there. And in fact, a friend of mine works for the RIAA, who is the anti-piracy czar, and did a presentation for Making Vinyl in Nashville in June. So there's an organization called the Vinyl Record Manufacturers Association that my co-founder of Making Vinyl, he is also the executive director of that organization. And they have best practices to prevent what you're suggesting. That, don't just take any customer, even if they offer cash. Do they really have the rightful rights to have this record made by you? So there are prosecutions going on constantly about it.
And for all the plans in legitimate countries have the intellectual property in these forms. You literally have to prove you own it in order to press it. And it could be your record, but if you don't clear the rights to songs that you've covered by other artists, you have to prove that you've actually licensed those songs from the licensing organizations in order to actually get the record released. So, but there are ersatz plants all around the world that are doing all kinds of things. There's always Czechoslovakia, Dubai. There was always these other plants that everybody would say what's going on. And the IFPI is one that actually monitors. They monitor the suppliers of the material to these plants. So you can tell by how much vinyl they're buying or how much polycarbonate they're buying will determine the actual output. So you're not going to, what's your stockpile of this? If you're buying enough to press 10 million, but you're saying you're only pressing 5 million, 5 million are going out the back door. That's how that works. So, that's how the industry is trying to protect itself with anti-piracy. It's very tough. There was an old saying during the record pressing days, when Elvis died. When Elvis died, every pressing plant was full because they all made copies. He was RCA, but guess what? Every record had a baby, they called it. And this is the one where, this one sounds scratchier than the others. Yeah, because it was a lacquer cut from a vinyl record. So they just took it, they just pirated it, and they just,
Do you want to talk?
The old timers were like really funny when Elvis died. It's like, man, we were sitting pretty. We pressed 24/7. It was wild times.
Randy and I know each other from the DVD business. But
yeah, I for 2 years I co-owned a vinyl plant in the mid '90s. Right as it was crashing and burning.
Do you regret selling it?
What was this?
Do you regret?
No. And the reason being is because it was like, would have had to suffer many, many years before it came back. We had 4 12-inch presses and 1 7-inch press. And it is a brutal industry.
What did you do? What did you do with the machinery?
Oh, it all got sold off. It all got auctioned. Actually, I think RPA probably bought about record products.
Oh,
Yeah. Parts.
they wanted the parts.
Yeah, we want parts. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, Frank.
When you were talking about shipped gold, returned platinum,
Yes.
you explain what that's all about.
Yes. So the corruption that I mentioned, the industry had 2 sets of books. I mean, the corruption actually in the record industry harks back to Alan Freed, accepting payola to play certain records. But in the 60s and 70s, when it turned into a real business, they had very creative accounting, and they had 2 sets of books. So they would say, and this was also a way to rip off the musicians. They basically said, well, we pressed, 5 million records, but so that was the platinum or whatever. The exact, I think 2 million is platinum actually. But it returned gold, meaning 1 million copies were returned. But what they also did was they started charging the musicians for the videos. But getting back to the creative accounting, what they would do is they would reverse it. They would say basically, well, it's shipped gold, but returned platinum, which is physically impossible. But they got away with it for a while. I think the IRS finally cracked down on some of the companies. And eventually the truth of that stuff started coming out. There were a couple of very good books that dealt with the dark side of the industry. And I actually did for Billboard an article about the Bob Marley estate and the litigations. And I actually interviewed one of the big counterfeiters who, John Lamont, his name was, who had to go into the witness protection program because he ratted out his mafia bosses. And he got beaten up. There's an amazing book called Stiffed where the whole story is told. But Universal was in the middle of the scandal, and they would do it with major artists like The Who, like any of the MCA big records would show up in I mentioned the cutout bins. Why would they end up in the cutout bin? It didn't make really a lot of sense, in terms of the creative accounting that they tried to get away with. And again, because the CDs, and this continued through the CD era, because they were accepting, accepting the returns on that, and then they would try to resell it in the used market, or also, they could recycle polycarbonate, which the CDs, right. And also, it's interesting in the vinyl current vinyl environment, the vinyl can get reground into reused. And it's funny, 5 years ago, you wanted pure vinyl, 180 gram pure vinyl. And then the labels realized that's not really a good thing to put out there, because first of all, regrinded polycarbonate, not polycarbonate, regrinded PVC sounds as good as 180 gram pure vinyl. And we want to be environmentally sound here, so they stopped focusing on the pure vinyl thing. One of the.
It's a slightly different sound. It actually is. It's physical.
You're saying the pure is better?
It's different.
Different. But it also is relative to the mastering, and there's so many things that go wrong.
That's a whole other discussion. Digital is creating the vinyl,
right?
Whereas it used to be analog used to create the analog.
Right. Well, getting back to that article that I hated so much. in the Wall Street Journal. This opened up with David Rawlings and Gillian Welch finding out that their record was sourced not from the original analog tapes, and they wanted it from the analog tapes. So they actually went through the trouble of buying back because they didn't like the sound of what was happening. David actually is now in partners in a new factory in Denver. And I saw David, he came to my Nashville conference, and he actually talked about starting that plant 2 years ago in Nashville when we had it there. That was the first in person making vinyl after the pandemic. Any other questions? Oh.
Yeah, the sugar beets.
Yeah.
You grind them into pellets. Those pellets, could they be sent out to any pressing plants?
They can. Yeah, and that's the other thing. We're not going to have an exclusive, because there's an antitrust issue on that too. And they want to, the company that developed this material is not only thinking about the music business, but PVC is used a lot in construction. So they're thinking of the materials that can be made out of it as well. So as I said, right now it's been processed in a small company in England, but they're making, pretty soon they're going to come up with an announcement that this major European company will be processing, and hopefully will be doing it elsewhere in the world. And I'm very hopeful it's in Iceland. In fact, one of the things I forgot to bring, I have some of the records. You can't tell looking at the record of Sugar Beats record. It looks just like it. And honestly, I didn't hear my first Sugar Beats record until we were in Iceland, when the chief advisor to Iceland Music, who was the former drummer in the Sugar Cubes, put it on this great stereo. And it was a movie soundtrack. And it was incredible how good it sounded. I was like, I didn't realize it was this good, potentially this good. Now, not everybody has that type of equipment for playback. And getting back to my daughter, when she was in college, she calls me and she goes, "You still doing that vinyl thing?" So I said, "Yeah." So she says, I want a record player, I said, "Oh, that's good." So she goes, "I know what I want. It's a Crosley. It's like one of those little suitcases. I know the color." And she says, "I'm sending you the link." And I had a friend who worked at Crosley. They were a sponsor of ours in 2018. So I said, "Well, you could probably do better than Crosley. Not to take anything away from them, but, let me get you a better setup." And he goes, No, this is what I want. And about a year and a half into it, she said to me, "Remember you said you could get me a better record?" So then I gave her, actually, somebody gave me an extra turntable. Her system sounds better than mine. I got her 2 bookshelf speakers that cost $100. It wasn't that expensive, but in a little preamp. And Tim has actually been through me with a series of turntables and things like that.
I got another good question about these sugar beets.
Yeah.
Vinyl records. I have records 60 years old or more. Right. They play great.
Right.
How do you know with a sugar beet based compound, how it's going to sound or stand up to repeated plays over 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years?
There's a university in England that is testing that specific thing. That there's a way they can age it.
Right.
It's above my IQ level in terms of method science. I was a words person always. And that's what Kevin.
People will think about it.
Yeah, Kevin understands the science of it all. So it's a great question. And I think the people who buy records today, because they're spending that much money on it, right, is not going to just throw it away. You know, and I really think the Swifties are not just putting it up on the wall as a collectible. I think they're listening to those records.
That's a good question, because, you know, regular vinyl is pretty durable,
Yeah.
especially if you take
Even-
good care of it.
Even tape. I got into reel 2 years ago. I had 60-year-old plus audio tape. Still sounds incredible. As long as it's taking.
It depends on the manufacturer.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah.
some of them-
Because a lot
Well, I know
of
it's all
it's
the
shared.
Ampex
A lot of it's
tapes.
shared. Yeah, a lot of it's shared. Yeah.
Well, they were all pre-recorded, so
Your question?
it doesn't have that.
Just
We
a-
have to make this the
Except that
last
it's-
one.
that's-
Just a comment, it's
Yeah.
really just a comment, and while we all are of a certain audience, and concerned about buying something and having it last, I'm not sure that the current audience is interested in 50 years from now. I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Well, it's a segment of the population, but as I said, that young people have gravitated towards this format bodes well for the future. So that, you know, I'm not saying like all of them will. A lot of them will just be perfectly
No,
fine.
for sure, but
with
if it doesn't
whatever they get
last
from the
50
phone.
years, it may not matter to them.
Right, but this is one of the frustrations. Like when I stupidly listened to my then girlfriend and digitized all my stuff, those drives died. As did the music. I lost a couple iPods, so I didn't even have that. I mean, you know, luckily I kept a good portion of my CDs, and
Physical doesn't die.
that's it.
I was on an international board that worked with NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NBC. I was involved in optical disc answer, working with the vinyl industry, and we did the 100-year optical disc for recordable. Came up with those standards. There's ways to do the advanced aging on.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And from everything I've read so far in terms of these organic, non-PVC types, they're not suggesting these compounds would not last as long, and they seem like it's all about actually the environmental conditions by which the media is stored has a lot more to deal with.
Yes.
So what is it being exposed to over time, what's not? So we found out even with optical discs where, you know, you had coatings. Like, well, first off, the 100-year disc is a gold sputter, which is not an aluminum sputter. So the aluminum oxidizes. Like when you see aluminum, you'd have to polish it if it's not coated. It is coated on a CD or an optical disc. It used to be called laser disc rot. I don't know.
Right,
Where
I remember that.
Where the coatings would actually oxidize over time. So, you know,
I
it's interesting.
Yeah.
How do the beat records taste?
That's a great one.
That's the most important
In case it
question.
fails, you eat.
Yeah, sweet, sweet. I have cards if anybody wants to stay in touch. And I said I would sign your book.
Just in case I
Thank
push
you
the
so
wrong
much
button
for
on my
this.
phone.
You're welcome. I liked your story.
Oh.
I know a couple.
I'm sorry.
And I'm here because of my kids who are
Yeah.
vinyl buyers.
Oh, that's great. What do they like? Taylor Swift?
Everything. No. Larry, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Here's my card if you want to stay in touch.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.